And then Bob has worked with both of us forever, right? We were actually all part of the first Agile team together, our first XP team. So, well, at least my first team and their second team, I think. So we have been together a long time, right? And Bob, say a few words about yourself.
Sure. So I'm SVP of Agile Transformation here at Lightspeed. Been working in the community since '99. We did not, in fact, invent the internet. It was the first XP team we had been on. I do know some of the folks on that first XP team, like Ron Jeffries and Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham and some of those folks. But I also have the Agile Toolkit podcast. I don't publish much there anymore, but I have a ton of interviews starting in around 2005. A lot of luminaries and regular practitioners as well. And in less infectious years, I'm the chair of the Agile DC conference, and I see a number of you that have been here at the Agile DC conference or been involved with Agile DC. So I'm hopeful for next year, 2021 Agile DC, hopefully at the Kellogg Conference Center.
As are we all.
Yep.
Wonderful. So again, welcome. We are going to talk about basically what is the case for VMO? Like, why does it matter to a team in particular? That's going to be the gist of things in just a moment here. And having laid out perhaps the respective problems and their respective priorities, we're going to talk about perhaps some different ways you might deal with them. What you're going to see as a general theme here is that there's not just one type of VMO, right? It really is going to vary and scale, focus to some degree, specific jobs depending on scale of the organization, other things that are going on, and a number of other factors. So we'll be sort of playing that out as we proceed and talking about some of the, how do you prioritize a portfolio, a quick section on dealing with OKRs, and talking about managing and driving change, right? Prioritizing value efforts and prioritizing process changes fundamentally here as we go along. And we're hoping to leave all of you with an idea of how this might play out for you practically speaking, right? And try to provide some examples that really helps to drive that conversation. So with no further ado then, we're going to do a quick Mentimeter poll. Many of you might have seen this tool in some of our classes before, but a simple polling tool. And we're going to ask you simply to rate how bad these problems are, if they're problems at all for your teams. And you'll see it here, right? So if you go to menti.com, M-E-N-T-I, and enter that 6-digit code there, you'll pop right in here and just slide the sliders where they go, submit it, and we'll start to see these popping up live as soon as the first person submits their response. And then that'll give us a sense of where we ought to focus the conversation here as we go along. So I'll just
and if you can't see, you're not zoomed enough, menti.com, and then the code is 991884.
And these are by no means all of the problems your teams might have, but you know, a good solid set, I think. May end up being one of the larger polls I've done, actually. Let's let a few more responses get in here and begin the witty banner. So thus far, this is working out more or less as I expected. Those top two are pretty much expected to be the worst. Okay, so as the last few of you are putting in your responses here, we're clearly seeing some themes emerge. We've got the situation that many teams have lots and lots going on, right? That a lot of work in process, a lot of projects, maybe even having to switch from one project to another midstream. Lots of context switching in terms of things coming in mid-sprint, let's say, and not really being woven into the fabric of the existing plan very smoothly and disrupting things. Looks like it's not too bad with the business outcomes. That's really about saying that do teams build things and then they ship them and they get that far, but they don't really get any sense of how much money it makes or what sort of process efficiencies it might drive. And thereby they don't really have a lot of direct connection to that purpose, that broader sense of what they're trying to do. Looks like process changes are pretty good on the whole. I see a couple of you rated that low, but most of you are decent enough. That's good to hear. Debt also slightly better than I expected, honestly. Perhaps this is become a little bit more prominent problem in the days of DevOps and all of that. And finally, big projects. This is an inevitable result of the too much whip and context switching thing almost. And many organizations, the way funding works tends to drive people to batch things up, right? Drive organizations to have big projects so that they can just simply get enough attention to get money. So this begins to lay out some of the basic problems that we're going to see. And I'd ask you to just keep these things in mind, right? Those problems that you're experiencing, and think about how some of the tactics that we're laying out here might perhaps help you to deal with some of these problems. So with that, very briefly, we're going to talk about, for those of you not familiar with the term already, the basic notion of a VMO. The VMO Value Management Office is something of a, reimagining of the classic PMO, but much less of a directive, heavyweight governance function in a central body, and much more of a dynamic, to some degree, virtually constructed team comprised of people from various levels. If you think of something like a scrum of scrums, as you'll see, that might be one of the ground level mechanisms by which a VMO operates. But typically scrums of scrums are really just the team members themselves. And perhaps, someone like a release train engineer or something akin to that if you're in a scaled environment. But what they don't tend to include are people above that level who often drive many of the decisions. So there are no executives there, right? You don't even have middle management there in many cases. And if those people are making the decisions and they're making them outside of the purview of the team, then you can miss things. So the essence of this is trying to expand to some degree the people that are involved to say, now we've got all the players we need to really accomplish, well, for one, solving those goals above. Those are by no means the only functions that a VMO would attack, by the way. Again, this is mostly focusing on the team perspective. Things like, dealing with a better balance at the portfolio level of new feature delivery versus debt reduction, let's say. Those might be things also that a VMO would help to decide, but it may be a little higher levels in some cases. So we're trying to say balance the ability to drive process changes with the ability to make sure the team's focusing on the most valuable stuff. So really, those are the two elements of it here. And we're trying to find also a way to, I'd say, shrink the meetings. I mean, that's part of the message we're going to send here is, in many organizations, you have way too many meetings with too many people and too many artifacts involved, and they're quite often redundant at some level, and sometimes they're simply excluding the people who need to be there, and therefore, one group may cause problems for another. So you're driving a cross-functional team. You can think of the team layer, nothing is really changing here as such. The VMO is the combination of representatives from the team, typically leadership functions like product owners and scrum masters at a minimum, and leadership at higher levels. And this includes, as you'll see, both executive and middle management, depending on the scale of things, so that we can actually make decisions. So the meetings aren't simply status meetings, they are action meetings as we go forth. And they tend to balance between these ideas of the process changes and the which features are projects we're going to do in many cases as well.
And this is really a reimagining of a meeting into more of a working session based on lean management principles of visualizing the work, understanding the work, flowing the value through the system. And we see structures like the Lean Agile Center of Excellence in SAFE, for example, taking that continuous improvement portion of the program while the product management team takes the value flow. Well, we don't believe those can be separable. You would never find Toyota thinking that value production and continuous improvement are somehow separate efforts. So marrying that change management, that continuous improvement, along with flowing to value, we think is critical to driving better outcomes.
Thanks, Bob. And so, as a few quick examples, if you think of this in a small organization, you know, a client I was working with recently, we're talking about a 20-person IT department for a large public university. There, the VMO consists of just the folks you see there, right? It's basically the CIO directly, his lieutenant, more or less, right, works alongside him, and then a few key business stakeholders. And these are, since it's a college, these are people like the provost, and these are people like, you know, the head of the admissions and things like that. And then you've got a few representatives. In this case, it's just 3 teams. So we've got 3 POs, 3 Scrum Masters, and they send some technical representatives occasionally. In bigger companies, right up in the 500 to say, you know, 2,000 or so employee range, then you're looking more at a little larger crew here, and possibly multiple value management offices that are focused on slightly different areas of the business, or sometimes slightly different operational sides of things. And here, you're seeing more of maybe a couple of layers, an executive layer, a little bit of a middle management layer. Maybe now you've got something like an Agile Center of Excellence, or the LACE that Bob mentioned, same thing, from SAFe terminology. And otherwise, the bottom level crew is always going to be the same, right? And then in big companies, it's much the same, but probably you've got even more of these VMOs focused on different areas. Going a little further, if you look at just how does this play out in practice, this was from I'd say mid to large size organization, this particular one, a pretty big one, but not tens and tens of thousands of people necessarily. They're really following a fairly straightforward SAFe process here. And here, what they've got is, they started out, it's not on this slide, but I'll say they started out with, in fact, daily 15-minute VMO sync meetings. And that led into what you're seeing here after a few weeks, after they got rolling and everybody got comfortable with one another, I suppose. They had weekly leadership syncs, you know, short and sweet there, as you see, just 15 minutes, much like a daily scrum. They had update syncs, which are combinations of, in many cases, not necessarily the entire team, to be totally clear, but again, the leadership functions from the teams, the scrum masters, product owners, and also some management here to help. If there are any problems, the idea is the managers can help to sort of clear the way for dealing with those problems. And then a tactical problem-solving session, pretty much, you know, exactly like a scrum of scrums in this particular case, but again, with a little bit higher level representation for more rapid escalation. And that was happening every week. And then once a month, you had something of a relatively standard SAFe style program increment planning session, which was 1 or 2 days here as you went along. And then 1 2-hour session that was just senior leadership, also just monthly, which is a high level strategic product review session. So a number of meetings here, right? Now, one issue that, you know, we noted here is, in this client, since they were really just starting into this, they were hesitant to let go of many of the older meetings. So that's a bit of an issue, right? And of course, that isn't the eventual idea. You're hoping that these meetings will replace the older ones. And I think that's a lot of what you're trying to, in the long run, accomplish, is try to make it simpler and make it a little lower level, and make the meeting shorter and include more people, so we can just have, you know, it could be, as Bob was mentioning, more of a working session. We can make decisions live rather than just having, you know, open status updates and like that don't really get us anywhere or produce value for the team. In a rather smaller environment, this is basically the small company I was describing up front. You can see it's real straightforward here. So they've got essentially 1 monthly session, much akin to PI planning, but at a vastly smaller scale. Since it's only 3 teams, it's about a half-day affair. And then there are weekly sessions with pretty standard PO and Scrum Master syncs here, which are quite short as well, right, as they go forth. And it says the SM sync was actually about 30 minutes, right? It's slightly longer, and the PO sync was a little shorter. But the basic point here is, right, this looks different at different scales. And it's not about doing it the same way every time. It's about saying, what are those problems that we need to have solved that don't seem to be being solved very well currently? And then we can find ways to address them by either pulling in more players who can make stronger decisions or clear the path, or by perhaps having more, more focused meetings to address some of those problems where they simply don't exist today, or we're waiting for permission. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to you for a moment here, Bob.
Great. So one of the things that most organizations struggle with as they move from project to product, which I love that movement of project to product. I unfortunately have a little problem with the product name, again, because not all value delivery is product centric, or a given value stream might deliver multiple products. And then the question is, you know, when you look at a government agency, it's delivering on a mission. Sometimes that's mandated. Sometimes the mission is internally generated. That's not a product, right? That is a set of services and a governance structure. So one of the things that a lot of organizations have started to use, and this is not a new idea, this idea of objectives and key results. Now there is a slight tweak to that more traditional KPI mindset that I sort of grew up in, and that was the cadence at which these objectives and key results are updated and the way they are generated. I often say that execution disconnected from strategy is a serious problem. Strategy disconnected from execution is a serious problem. Again, if we look at Toyota Production System and the development of lean thinking, there was always strategy along with execution and a very good bidirectional conversation, right? Quotes like, no good improvement was invented at a desk tells you that, you know, they're focused on the people delivering the work to be involved in improving the work. So typically, organizations also will set many internal objectives, and what we believe is a refocusing on value, on mission value, on business value, on real value to the marketplace delivery, is a way of linking those things. So when we work in a value management office, we don't like to see objectives like that are focused on internal processes. We want to see objectives that are driving real business results, because ultimately organizations are in business to do business. There's a cadence of creating objectives. Those are conversations between the teams, that VMO and the executive action level. There may be OKRs at each level, but those key results are measurable. Typically prefer quantitative metrics that will say, are we moving in the right direction? Are we steering towards that objective? And those are renegotiated and revisited at least on a quarterly cadence, or more frequently if necessary. Many organizations have a competitive marketplace and customer needs that evolve faster than quarterly. One of the things that we think, and Arlen mentioned that they can have different cadences, is SAFe gives a guidance that a quarter is the starting recipe, and that may be appropriate for certain organizations, or you may need a much faster cadence. When I was doing an engagement at Citizenship and Immigration Service, they had a planning execution cadence that was every 4 weeks, and they would change, pivot if necessary, if things had changed substantially. Next slide, please. Okay, so you know these OKRs are focused on a real business outcome, and then the key results that are there to drive them. And they should be focused on that business thing. Next slide, please. Now, fundamentally at the team level, right, the teams are involved in saying, here's what we think we can do. Strategy is saying, here's the objective we want to meet. And we have this negotiated settlement in the middle. And then the VMO is charged with how do we map out our backlog of work? How do we flow the most important things that will drive these key results that will ultimately lead to these objectives? How do we ideate? So just product discovery or service discovery. How do we validate? How do we down select? How do we execute? And how do we operationalize? And how do we, most importantly, reduce the time to value from when we start to work on an item to we deliver an item? And the one thing that we see in most organizations, which we saw in the Mentimeter, is they've got way too many things in flight. I'll use the analogy, some of you may have heard it before. We know, at least in the DC area, what 100% utilization of a resource looks like when there's a car in every spot that you could have a spot, a car in on the highway. What do we call that? Anybody pitch in? And the Houston, you can join us too, because you have the same problem.
Accident waiting to happen.
Gridlock.
It's a traffic jam and an accident waiting to happen, right? Nothing is moving, nothing's being delivered. Everybody's busy driving and nobody's getting anywhere. So one of the main things that a VMO has to do is limit WIP, keep some buffer so that we can improve time to value. And that's just a lesson straight out of Lean.
I'll just note, Bob mentioned CIS. For instance, Mark Schwartz, the CIO at the time during that project, part of his so-called product budget objectives model really is linked to the same general idea of one other potential utility that OKRs have is to say, hey team, this is what the business is trying to accomplish. And then, the team actually generates the backlog themselves from that, as opposed to many teams inherit both the business objectives and the backlog. And to some degree, that limits their ability to be creative and present solutions that might be a lot faster and more direct than the ones that the business, so to speak, came up with on their own.
Yeah, and a classic use of these by Mark Schwartz was they knew for lots of reasons the E-Verify system usage was going to go up. They could easily scale the infrastructure because that's cloud. What they couldn't do is scale the adjudicator. So if they're getting more applications, somebody's got to look at that application. It's going to take longer to pull that application through. So he said, and there were some others, but the three he highlighted in his DevOps talk. I want you to improve the dropout rate. So there are a lot of people are automatically verified. So we want to reduce the number of folks that drop out. Improve the adjudicator, their ability to handle greater caseload by giving them information or tools or training. And I want you to improve the data availability across the organization. And he said, I don't care if it's training, I don't care if it's IT spend, I don't care if it's business process restructuring, move the needle on this outcome. Product owner, Scrum team, you've got freedom to choose what you want to do. Now, if you don't have a value flow model, you can't use scope as a governance tool in that situation. Because scope is variable. It's only the outcome that matters.
Right? So we're going to do one more breakout around this. And the basic questions are, okay, right, so we have these OKR things. Are you using this already? If so, how's it going? Right? Is it, you think it's successful? It's helping your teams? It's, too far afield from the teams to be useful. They're not updated often enough. So, however they're currently working. And if you're not using them, do you have something similar, a different mechanism to say, team, this is what the business is really trying to accomplish. And here's a way you can see whether we're accomplishing that or not in some manner of a tangible metric that we can look at and say, yep, we got it, or we didn't get it, or we got it to some particular degree. And either that's satisfactory or it isn't. So I was going to send us into four-person breakout rooms. And for this, we're going to spend about, I'm thinking 5 minutes, on this, just to really, now I'll give you a little bit more. We'll give you 8 minutes on this one to chat about it and discuss, again, how you're currently linking strategy to execution, how we're letting the teams know what the business outcomes their products or services are actually generating. So here we go. Now, welcome back. It's since that's important parts over with there. So any major observations here? I'm not going to, pull it from the whole crowd here, but just if anyone has a major insight about, something that they working well, not working well.
In our group, we just had we had an interesting dialogue because there was a stark contrast between how this plays out in the government space and how it plays out in the commercial space. So that was an interesting fun fact.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
We all agreed that we wanted to measure stuff, but it's very, very challenging, especially when you're trying to measure things value-based, because you have the big problem is what is really providing value, what isn't. It's real easy to measure, to create a long list of requirements and say, yes, we've hit 15 of those 30 requirements, so we're on track, even if those 15 requirements are worthless. But
Right. Yeah.
But we're on track. So it's a big challenge to truly measure what's important and not have that measurement be seen as a stick.
Yeah.
And have it be seen as really, here's an opportunity for the leaders to go in and help this team.
Yeah. Yeah. If you look traditionally and you think about, hey, what happens if we don't meet our KRs, right? I mean, do people get fired? Because if you have a situation like that, then people are going to create them as self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Where they just are invariably going to be met. And then we're not gaining much of anything. I don't know if you noticed, but OKRs, they're really meant to be a little bit ambitious, right? You're meant to kind of push the bar just a little bit at least, and which means you may, and you know it well, you may not make them sometimes, and that may be okay if you hit a certain point of them. But of course, people are not going to be inclined to do that if they'll just get in trouble for reaching for the moon. So, yeah.
Right. Now, how do you feel about OKRs being used to focus on behavior as opposed to outcomes?
Give me an example of what you're thinking.
One of the things is we want to move a lot more stories through. We want to deliver a lot more of whatever we deliver.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in doing that, what you're really doing is you're encouraging the teams to break things up into smaller chunks and create as much flow as possible.
Right.
Which is a great behavior. The outcome may not be fabulous at first, but you've implemented a great behavior that's going to help you long term.
So this is a really classic strategy. So for example, Mark Schwartz, one of the first things he did is say, okay, you delivering in 18 months, super, we're going to deliver in 6 months. Okay, now we're going to deliver in 3 months. Now it's going to be 2 months. And then really shorten that timeline. Now, were we building the right thing at that point? No, but he knew that if he couldn't get stuff to flow through the system, there was no way he'd be able to run experiments to figure out what the right things were. Mm-hmm. And he had an experimental mindset. When he rolled it out into some of the branch chiefs had come back with experiments, and he said, too many of your experiments are green. You're not thinking creatively enough if all of your experiments are succeeding, right? You're doing the easy stuff, and we're not going to fundamentally change the outcome of the agency if we just do the easy stuff, right?
And presumably as part of that message, he was also saying, look, if they're not all green, we're not going to lay all you off immediately as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. There's a federal union. He was on.
There's a pregnant pause there, Bob. Yeah, probably not, right?
So I put a link to a great talk by Mark Schwartz at DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2018. So I really recommend watching that. It covers a lot of what Bob and Arlen are speaking about.
Yeah, that's where the story Bob was mentioning from E-Verify, he fleshes that out a little bit more in that talk. The next.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to work with him when he was implementing that at CIS. So.
Yeah, just I guess one other comment here to Bob's point. If you're going to use something like OKRs, you must look at them experimentally, right? Because you're going to start with something. A lot of the instances I've seen, the baselines are not even necessarily that good. I mean, you might be starting from a point where you don't even really know where you are yet. And you're simply putting a stake in the ground to say, let's go ahead and give it a shot and sort of see what happens. which means you need to reformulate them, right? There needs to be a strategy for ensuring that if they don't make sense, well, you're changing them as you go along. So it doesn't become too rigid. And the same goes for who creates them and when, right? If this is coming strictly top down, you're going to have problems, right? And if you really want to give some autonomy to the team to step up, because then they're more accountable for the results if it's partially their decision.
You know,
right.
To your point, Arlen, I would just say like that those two things that you just mentioned are probably some of the two most difficult things that in my organization people have a hard time wrapping their heads around. The notion of a sort of a goal that is not meant to be met 100%, A, and B, this notion of an empirical process, which is what OKRs are meant to be. They're meant to be continually iterated on. You know, especially if you're new to them, you know, you need to give yourself a lot of room. And that whole mindset of, hey, we trust that you're the right people, so this is not meant to be punitive in any way or grounds for any action, you know, for management against you. This is meant for you all to sort of find yourselves, essentially, like, you know, and double down on what you're good at and all the rest. And it seems like these things have not yet clicked where I work. So it's a big part of what I do is just kind of trying to advocate for OKRs outside of the rigors of day-to-day work. I try to use them as an example when I'm teaching my like basic Agile courses, framework courses, whatever, and really try to show how they do kind of embody the ethos of agility.
Exactly. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, it's an area where when people have freedom, they will often execute it. But if they've never had freedom, it's hard to convince them it's a good thing sometimes. They feel safer taking orders. So you really got to watch out for that pattern. In terms of managing this, again, a lot of the basic process is not so dissimilar from your traditional scrum of scrums. It may, in fact, be exactly that with a few more people and a few more agenda items. But part of it tends to be visual management in some sense and seeing what's in the portfolio in a quick and easy way that everybody in the VMO can get a hold of. And this in and of itself can, to some degree, reduce the churn around status meetings and gaining visibility into the progress against your efforts and your OKRs. So we're really trying to make this something that's as simple as possible, right? And that really helps us to focus on the right things. Actually, Dan and I were talking right there in the breakout time about the idea of WIP limits, right? Which is the little red numbers you're seeing at the top of these columns, as I imagine many of you know, that WIP limits can drive a lot of focus here as well and help to make sure that the team's not having too much work in process and context switching, which, you know, you had noted as a couple of the most troublesome problems. So it can really make that visible. And the basic mechanism you're using here, for what it's worth, is flow, right? What you're really looking at is, are things moving smoothly from one side over to the other, or are they piling up in some certain stage, at which point you can begin to adjust some of the WIP limits to deal with that. And in terms of how the VMO attacks this side of things, so you're seeing there are basically two types of meetings you'll see. You saw in those more complicated scenarios, sometimes these end up being split into a few more, but still the essence is these two core things. One of them is about, what are we going to do next, basically? What, from a project perspective or a product perspective, what features, what values, what services should the team deliver in this next stage? And this is a prioritization session. It can happen in the large, it can happen in the small. In the large, we're talking about things much like PI planning. It might happen every month, every couple of months, every few months, probably not much more much more often than monthly, though, in most cases. And then you probably have more frequent kind of check-in and update style meetings, which are what things like PO syncs are about. And so usually here, so we're talking, again, monthly to quarterly, and then the sessions we're laying out, here are some of the things we're considering doing, right? Here are some of how the portfolio is performing now against our OKRs. Here are some of the OKRs we want to do more with, ones we want to start attacking we haven't done yet. And we're trying to line up our plans really against all of that to make sure we're coming up with a sensible plan. And I'll make another point here. I'm showing an agenda. Do not take this as that's the agenda for this, right? Again, the exact way you formulate it, it depends to some degree on what problems you're encountering and how you want to solve them, the people you're able to engage in this, and also I think what else exists. So again, as part of the message, if you have other meetings, and many companies do, this might be several meetings that this happens right now, whether you're in an agile environment or you're not, we're trying to coalesce those to the degree we possibly can. The more we can have one conversation and make a decision live together, top to bottom, the faster this is going to be, and also the more bought in everyone's going to be. If leadership makes one decision over here in this meeting, and then they come and just tell the team about it over in this one, we're much less likely to have that nice, rich, bi-directional conversation. So we're hoping to take it and really coalesce it into more of a actionable sort of working session here. And, you know, is of course one of the ways you do that. Part of this is coming up with sensible prioritization schemes. And certainly in the past few years, the notion of so-called economic prioritization has become very, very popular, right? And this idea of using time, right? Using cost of delay or using urgency as a factor is something that the Agile environment really brings to bear that doesn't make any sense in waterfall. It's, if you're only going to deliver once, then why are we talking about whether urgency matters or not? We've already set a date. But if we're looking at things in a little bit more fine-grained fashion, then we can say that if we don't deliver this now, but we deliver it a month from now, it isn't going to make any real difference to the amount of money it brings in. So we could easily enough defer it in favor of things that are in fact going to decay in value if we don't do them soon. So that basic notion of let's look at things from that perspective. It has a certain value now. Would it have the same value later? If so, that's intrinsically drops the priority a little bit here. If the answer is, you know, yeah, the value is dropping rapidly, then we've got a call to make. We either move now or we lose it, okay? And that often makes these decisions a little crisper because there's always that tension between the stuff we know we've got to do for the, you know, the audit or whatever sort of thing that's coming down the pike that we don't have choices on. And to some degree, we're trying to fill in the rest of the portfolio around those things where we don't have choices in the discretionary work, so to speak. So in terms of how this works, just briefly, probably most of you know this, but it's a matter of looking at value and urgency as the numerator there, and then looking at how long it takes, or the basic effort, you know, is on the bottom. And this is done in a number of different ways. I've always liked the notion of splitting so-called internal and external value. I think it's a nice way to look at things. External value stuff like, you know, straight up profitability and ROI and bringing in money to the company, or whereas operational value tends to be internal process efficiencies, making things faster, process changes, reducing debt, stuff like that, that helps us to deliver more effectively going forward. Some projects have both. Most tend to favor one over the other. And effort can be calculated however you like, frankly, as long as these numbers are relatively comparable. It could be sprints, could be points, could be days, could be whatever you want, okay? So it's just a matter of getting some way to balance one thing against another thing. And that can help to drive a common decision. I'll just say in some of the places where I've done this recently, like the university, it's a matter of about 8 or 9 total factors that in fact drive the prioritization. So these aren't everything. But there are a lot of these are factors that are quite specific to the university. Like one of the most important things for universities is admissions, right? I mean, how many people get into the university? So is this going to help the admissions process is actually one of their specific factors. So in other words, it's not going to be generic necessarily. It'll be specific to the situation. All right. And then I think, Bob, you're going to pick this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, as we start to look at all of these engagements in this cross-level VMO, we're linking strategy to execution, and execution is informing strategy. The key is, again, with this structure is we want to flow the work. Time to value, time to mission value, business value is critical to look at. And then drive the change. How do we improve that flow of value? I like to think of 3 areas when I'm looking at a value stream. Time to value, so we're flowing value effectively. We're doing it at the appropriate quality, because otherwise we won't be able to maintain that flow of value. And we do it sustainably in the organization so that nobody's hair is on fire trying to deliver. Nobody goes crazy at the Georgetown, Kentucky Toyota plant when they order 2,300 Camrys, right? They just turn around, they wave as you're on the little trolley going through. Highly recommend that tour as well. But we have to link it with the continuous improvement that drives the change to improve the value flow, just like Toyota, just like Amazon. If you think Jeff Bezos says, no, we're doing good enough. We don't need to improve market share or ability to deliver things to customers. You're crazy, right? He is thinking about that all the time, and he's driven that culture into the organization. Next slide, Arlen, because I know we have another little session at the end and a closeout, and I want to respect people's time. Visualizing the work, managing time to value, and creating those interactive structures where the team is engaged with the people that are defining value is important. Have the conversation. You don't have to be perfect, right? What does value mean in your organization? I don't know. Maybe you don't even know. But if you don't write something down, you won't be wrong, right? Write it down, start to measure it, and figure out, was that the right way to measure it? Maybe, maybe not. It is empirical process control embodied. You can't improve if you don't know you're wrong. And if you don't measure, I don't care. It's just an opinion. Data doesn't care about your opinion, right? The measurements always win.
Bob? So as our final breakout, right, we're just trying to tie some of these ideas together and say, currently you've got a number of different issues here you might need to deal with at a team level. And again, think back to that initial little survey we did there as well, and some of the problems that you raised, and ask yourself, are all those being cleanly handled today? And do you feel like that they're effective, the meetings you have, the people who are involved in the meeting, they're taking care of the problem already? And if not, do you think you could maybe, who else would you need to introduce these meetings? What other meetings would you need to have? Do you have redundant meetings today that you could get rid of? That's a little bit of the essence of this, to say, let's look at all these issues and say, if all this is perfect today and everybody loves the way it's going, then maybe this isn't going to help you that much. But in most places we've been, that's not quite the case. There are a few of these that are sticking points, and it has a lot to do with either not having the right people at the table or perhaps having a lot more overhead than is required to actually solve this problem. So we're going to do one last breakout here. And for this one,
let's keep it short.
Yeah, I'm going to do about 5 minutes here. And we're going to.
And if the folks in your breakout room leave, feel free to come back to the main session, and we're still chatting about it over here.
Okay.
Anne knows that, yeah.
And know that Sanjeev is writing a book. Sanjeev and Roland are doing a book on the VMO. I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the close. But
exactly.
And Audrey.
And Audrey, yes, absolutely.
All right, so I've set the timer, Audrey, for the breakout room for 5 minutes, and we'll pull back and we'll wrap up when we get back. Okay, so here we go.
I bet I can get us a dozen volunteers.
I'm sure you can.
He's a very convincing guy. Well, welcome back, everyone. So hopefully you had a rich conversation there. We're up against the edge of our time here, so I certainly don't want to, I'm not going to go into any big discussions about it. But again, what we really want to leave you with here is probably you've got too many meetings and not the right meetings and not the right people to meetings at some level somewhere in your organization. And much of the idea here is to begin to take and look at it anew and say, where could we reformulate things and maybe pull together people in a way we haven't previously and really get some more action at the ground level. And it can really help teams because definitely a little less context switching, everybody be a lot happier. So, we noted right before you left there, but we got a book coming on this. And Sanjeev, you want to speak to that? Like, when do you think it's going to be live?
I don't know. Audrey has all the dates. Audrey, are you around?
I have the dates, but I've got a screaming baby. So early next year, we have PMO to VMO book coming out, covering lots of topics on this.
Excellent.
Oh.
Maybe we'll announce it officially. Look for a cute little face there. So, all right. Then thank you all so much for attending. And if any parting words,